The Darwin's Hope drifted quietly through the cold emptiness of space. A small, survey ship designed for deep space mapping, it had been 6 months since its crew left Earth, and every day felt like the one before. The hum of the engines was a constant companion, and the flickering stars outside were just dots in a vast, silent sea. Commander Helen Wright sat in her chair on the bridge sipping coffee that tasted more like recycled water than anything remotely comforting. The crew was tired. They'd been scanning star systems, cataloging planets that no one would ever visit. Most of them had long ago stopped pretending to care about the routine. Even the reports were the same, nothing ever changed. She flicked through another set of survey data, barely registering the numbers. She was too tired to focus. Everything felt monotonous, even the task she had been trained for until... Beep, beep, beep. The loud shrill of the alarm shattered the silence. Helen's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a drill. She dropped her datapad and rushed to the console, her boots thudding on the metal floor. Her mind raced, and she tried to push the grogginess from her body. "Report," she barked, her voice sharp with sudden urgency. Lieutenant Ben Cooper was already at his station, his fingers moving fast across the console's controls. His face was pale as he read the data flashing across his screen. "It's a distress signal, Commander," Ben said, his voice strained. "From Veles Prime." Helen's heart clenched. Veles Prime. She knew the planet, peaceful, agricultural, home to about 3 million people. They had no military, no weapons, nothing that could fight back. A world under the protection of the Galactic Council, the vast interstellar alliance that governed the galaxy. "Who's sending the signal?" Helen asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ben's fingers flew across the screen as he double-checked the transmission source. His expression turned even more grim as he read the next set of data. "It's coming from Veles Prime, Commander, no mistake." His voice was barely above a whisper. Helen stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what he was saying. Veles Prime had always been a world the Council protected. The Krath, alien invaders known for their brutal tactics, had been declared enemies of the Council for years. Yet here it was, a distress signal from a world that was supposed to be shielded. "Put it through," she said, her voice tighter now but still resolute. The air on the bridge grew heavy as the audio feed crackled to life, a static buzz filling the room before it cleared. Then, a voice, high-pitched and panicked, spoke in the common galactic language, one that Helen could understand but barely recognize. "This is Veles Prime. We are under attack. The craft came 3 days ago. Our cities are burning. Millions are dead. Please, someone help us. Our children are dying. Please." The message looped, repeating the same desperate words over and over. The sound of children crying, of screams from the streets, filled the bridge. Helen's stomach turned. The Krath had launched an assault on Veles Prime, and the Council hadn't responded, not one ship, not one fleet. There had been no response, no intervention, nothing. "How long has this been broadcasting?" Helen asked, her voice low. 4 days, Ben replied, his voice strained. "The signal's weakening, their power grid is failing." 4 days, Helen whispered to herself. 4 days of screaming for help, and no one had come. She looked at the video feed on the screen, showing the destruction below. Even from space, the fires were visible, consuming entire cities. Massive insect-like Krath ships hovered in the atmosphere, their silhouettes ominous and terrifying. Smaller craft darted down to the surface, firing indiscriminately, turning once thriving population centers into rubble. People fled through the streets, some with children in tow, others with nothing but the clothes on their backs. "They were supposed to be protected," Lieutenant Maya Torres murmured from her station, her face pale. "The Council was supposed to protect them." Helen clenched her fists. She had always believed in the Council, in its power to protect the innocent. But now she was staring at a scene that told a very different story. Helen turned to Ben, her eyes hard. "What about Council forces? There has to be a response fleet, a military response. The Council can't just leave them like this." Ben shook his head. "I've been checking every military frequency. There's nothing, no fleet movement, no response. It's like they don't even know what's happening, or they don't care." Helen's mind raced. "That's impossible. Protocols require immediate response to any distress signal from a protectorate world, especially from a Krath attack." "Well," Ben said bitterly, "no one told the Council that." Helen's gaze turned to the view screen. She knew there was no way the Darwin's Hope could fight a Krath fleet. The ship wasn't a warship. It was a survey vessel equipped with a few defensive guns but no real firepower to take on an enemy fleet. Still, it didn't matter. The message on the screen flickered, showing a mother carrying two children through a burning street, an elderly man helping the injured, teenagers doing their best to fight the fires with nothing but buckets of water. These were the people she was fighting for, the innocent, the helpless, the ones who needed saving. "Contact Earth Command," she ordered suddenly, her voice firm and unyielding. "Commander, we're not authorized to request military intervention. We're supposed to follow the proper channels and wait for orders," Greg Sullivan, her second-in-command, said from across the room, his voice cautious. "I don't care about proper channels," Helen snapped, her eyes fierce. "These people are dying while the galaxy sits on its hands. Someone needs to know what's happening here." Ben nodded and immediately started composing the message, sending it out to Earth Command, along with the distress signal, tactical readings, and video feeds. He turned back to her. "It'll take about 6 hours for a response," he said, his voice steady, but the weight of the situation hung in the air. Helen watched the countdown timer appear on her screen. 6 hours, 6 hours of waiting, 6 hours while the planet below burned. "Plot a course for Veli's Prime," Helen said, her voice steely. "Maximum speed." "Commander," Greg said, moving in front of her, his expression tense. "We're a survey ship. We have 40 crew members and 2 small defensive guns. We can't fight a fleet. No one expects us to fight the Krath." "I know," Helen said quietly, "but we're going. I won't sit here while they die down there." The tension in the room was palpable. The crew gathered, uncertain of what was to come. Greg, despite his reservations, gave a slow nod, signaling his understanding. He wasn't going to stop her. "Let's go save some lives," Helen said quietly, her gaze fixed on the screen that showed the burning planet below. As the Darwin's Hope set its course, the timer counted down. Helen knew what she had to do, but the next 6 hours would test her, and the crew, like never before. They were headed into the heart of the fire, and they didn't even know if they'd survive the journey. The Darwin's Hope streaked through the dark expanse of space, engines burning hot as they made their way toward the burning world of Veli's Prime. The ship was built for exploration, not for combat. Its hull was sleek, designed for mapping star systems and cataloging planets, not withstanding fire from an alien fleet. Yet here it was on a collision course with a nightmare. Helen stood on the bridge, staring at the distant stars through the panoramic window. The crew was at work, preparing the ship for a long and potentially deadly journey. Outside, the stars gleamed coldly, oblivious to the disaster unfolding on Veli's Prime. Helen's mind raced with questions and doubts, but her resolve was unshaken. The decision was made. She had no intention of abandoning the millions of people crying out for help. "Commander," Ben said, breaking her thoughts. He was at his station, tracking their course. "We're still on course for maximum speed. We should reach Veli's Prime in just under 5 hours. "Good," Helen replied, her voice calm, but inside she could feel the tension building. There was no turning back now. "Keep me updated on any changes in the Krath fleet's position." "Aye, Commander," Ben responded, his fingers tapping away at his console. He sounded less certain than usual. Helen turned to look at Lieutenant Maya Torres, who was monitoring the ship's systems. Maya was young but sharp, and Helen trusted her instincts. "Maya, any issues with the engines or shields?" Helen asked, her tone steady. "Everything's holding, Commander," Maya replied, glancing up at her with a small, worried smile. "We're pushing this ship to its limits, though. It wasn't designed for this kind of speed or stress." Helen nodded. "We have to make it. There's no other choice." Maya's eyes flickered with something like understanding, but there was a hint of hesitation. "Understood." The sound of the ship's engines hummed through the floor, a constant reminder of how far they were pushing the Darwin's Hope past its intended purpose. Helen could feel the vibrations in the deck beneath her boots. The crew was alert but quiet, knowing the stakes. Everyone had heard the distress signal, had seen the desperate faces on the video feed. 5 hours, Greg Sullivan said as he stepped onto the bridge, his eyes serious. "We'll be within range of the Krath fleet soon. Are we really going through with this?" Helen didn't look at him, her eyes still fixed on the stars. "We are." Greg sighed. "I don't need to remind you how outgunned we are, Commander. This is madness, but you know I'll follow your orders." He paused before adding, "I just want to make sure we're all clear on the risks." "We've been clear on the risks from the start," Helen said, her voice unwavering. "We're not going to sit back and wait for the council. Someone needs to stand up for Veli's Prime. I'm not waiting for orders. We'll do what we can, even if it's just getting some people out." Greg leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, considering her words. "You're asking a lot of us. There's only so much we can do with a survey ship." Helen met his gaze now. "We'll do everything we can, Greg. If it costs us, it costs us. But we can't stand by and let them die." Greg studied her for a long moment. "I just don't want anyone thinking we didn't know what we were walking into." Helen turned to face him fully. "We all know the risks, and we'll be ready for whatever comes our way." A long silence followed. Then Greg gave a slow nod, seemingly resigned to the mission. "Understood." As the hours stretched on, the tension in the ship grew. Helen could sense the unease among the crew, especially as they neared the edge of the Veli system. The Darwin's Hope was not equipped for combat. Its shields were designed to withstand the occasional asteroid, not the full firepower of an alien fleet. The ship's small defensive guns were nothing compared to the Krath's massive capital ships. Still, Helen held her ground, knowing that this was the right thing to do. It was her responsibility to lead this crew, to give them a chance to make a difference. Ben interrupted her thoughts. "Commander, we're approaching the edge of the Veli system. I'm detecting a large fleet, multiple Krath ships in orbit around the planet. They're moving in a defensive formation." Helen felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had hoped the Krath would be distracted by their attack, but it seemed they had already anticipated that someone would come to Veli's Prime's aid. "How many ships?" Helen asked, her voice tight. Ben scrolled through the data. At least 50 capital ships, maybe more, and several dozen smaller fighters. Helen exhaled slowly. This was worse than she'd feared. They were outgunned and outnumbered by a factor of 10. "We need to find a way to help," Helen said firmly, her mind already working. "Maya, Ben, let's brainstorm a plan." Maya turned her head, her face grim. "We're not going to be able to break through their defenses, Commander. The Darwin's Hope is no match for their firepower." "I know," Helen replied. "But we can help get the civilians out. We'll need to stay mobile, stay unpredictable. They won't expect us to be as fast as we are." Ben's fingers flew across his console. "I've got an idea, but we'll need to be close, too close for comfort." "Give me the details," Helen said. She wasn't going to waste time. Ben hesitated for a moment. "We can use the planet's magnetic field to make a quick descent into one of the remaining safe zones. It'll scramble the Krath sensors for a few minutes. Enough time to drop a few landing crafts and evacuate civilians. We'll need to be quick, though. One wrong move and we'll be sitting ducks." Helen thought for a moment. It was dangerous, but it was their best shot. "Do it," she said, her voice resolute. "Maya, Ben, coordinate with the crew. I'll contact Corin and the other leaders on the ground. We need to be ready for anything." The crew went to work immediately, preparing the ship for the dangerous descent. Meanwhile, Helen sent a message to Corin, the Velison leader who had already begun organizing the civilian evacuations on the surface. The communication was shaky, but she could hear the urgency in Corin's voice as he responded. "We're ready," Corin said, his voice strained but determined. "But we can't hold out for long. The Krath are relentless." "We're coming," Helen said, her voice firm. "Hold on for just a little longer." The Darwin's Hope descends toward Veli's Prime's surface, its engines straining as the magnetic field causes instability. The Krath fleet detects them. The countdown to the landing is ticking. Can they get the civilians off the planet before the Krath turn their full force on them? The descent into Veli's Prime's atmosphere was like diving into the heart of a storm. The Darwin's Hope shook as it cut through the dense clouds, engines straining against the gravitational pull. The ship's hull groaned under the stress, but it held. For now. Helen gripped the edge of her chair, her gaze fixed on the view ahead. The tactical display on the bridge showed the chaotic storm of Krath warships above, the swarming fleet like locusts, blocking any potential escape routes. Their fighters darted through the air, weaving between the burning ruins of Veli's Prime below. "We're in," Ben said, his voice sharp with concentration. "Magnetic fields scrambled their sensors. We've got 5 minutes before they catch on. We need to move fast." Helen nodded. "Give me a direct line to Corin." Ben tapped a few buttons. A few seconds later, Corin's face flickered onto the screen, his eyes wide with the desperation of someone who had seen too much pain in too short a time. The scars of Veli's Prime's destruction were etched on his face, a world ravaged by the Krath. "We're coming in hot, Corin," Helen said, her voice steady. "We'll have a few minutes before the Krath realize we're here. You ready?" Corin's expression tightened. "Ready as we'll ever be, Commander. The survivors are gathering near the old hospital, but they've been under constant attack and the Krath are getting closer. We can't stay long." "We'll drop as many people as we can," Helen replied, her eyes scanning the view ahead. "We'll be in and out fast. Just make sure your people are ready." "I'll make sure they are," Corin said, his voice resolute. "We won't let you down." The transmission cut off. Ben turned his chair back to his console. "We're approaching the landing zone. Looks like a few Krath fighters are already moving toward the area." Helen stood, her mind sharpening. "Prepare the landing crafts. We'll use the distraction to our advantage. Once we're on the ground, we'll need to split the crew. Some of us will secure the landing zones. The rest will help get people to safety." Greg stepped forward, adjusting his uniform. His face was tight with apprehension. "We're not just facing the Krath fleet up there, Commander. We've got ground forces to worry about. If we land, they'll be on us in seconds." Helen nodded. "That's why we need to move fast. We're not here to fight, we're here to get people out. You're in charge of the ground team, Greg. Make sure you clear the area before the civilians arrive." Greg gave her a firm nod. "Understood, we'll cover the evac routes." The Darwin's Hope shuddered again as it entered the turbulent atmosphere. A glance at the viewport showed the planet below, a wasteland of destruction. Cities that had once been full of life were now burning ruins, fires rising into the sky like monuments to loss. They were getting close. The countdown on the ship's control panel was ticking down, each second bringing them closer to the surface and the chaos that awaited. On the surface, Corin stood at the center of the old hospital's courtyard, watching the sky. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning buildings. He could hear the distant hum of Krath fighters approaching, their insect-like shapes cutting through the smoke, their guns ready to fire. Around him, the survivors of Veli's Prime huddled together. Men, women, children, families torn apart by the Krath's relentless assault. Most of them were scared, uncertain, not knowing whether they would ever see their homes again. But they had no choice. The Krath had destroyed everything they knew. "Stay calm," Corin said to the group, his voice firm. "The Darwin's Hope is coming. We'll get you out." He didn't know how long they would have. Minutes, seconds, every sound in the air seemed to be a death sentence, every approaching Krath ship a threat to their fragile hope. And then, as if on cue, the ground trembled beneath his feet. He turned to see the Darwin's Hope breaking through the smoke, its descent rapid and controlled. A faint cheer rose from the survivors, but it was cut short by the sound of Krath fighters swooping in on their position. "Move now," Corin shouted, ushering the survivors into the nearby buildings for cover. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the ship lower itself toward the ground, its landing struts barely skimming the surface. As the ship's rear hatch opened, the first landing craft shot out like a bolt of lightning. The roar of the engines filled the air, drowning out everything else. Helen's voice came over the comms, steady and commanding. "We're here. Get your people to the transports, now." Back on the ship, Helen's pulse raced as the first wave of survivors flooded toward the landing craft. The Darwin's Hope had done its job, but now the crew had to hold their ground long enough to get as many civilians off the planet as possible. Greg led his team onto the surface, his weapon at the ready. The ground was charred, the air thick with smoke and the bitter scent of burning ruins. "Clear the area," Greg shouted as he and his team began to move through the destroyed streets, securing a path for the evacuees. Helen's heart pounded in her chest as she watched from the ship's control room. There was no room for error. One misstep and the Krath would be on them in seconds. Through the ship's sensors, she could see the Krath fighters circling like vultures, anticipating their every move. They knew the Darwin's Hope couldn't outrun them, not in the atmosphere. The Krath had them trapped, just like they had trapped the people of Veli's Prime. Suddenly, the ship's alert system blared. Ben's voice cut through the tension. "Commander, Krath reinforcements, a whole squadron coming in fast. We don't have much time before they surround us." Helen's mind raced, her eyes darting between the ship's controls and the tactical map. "We need more time. We're not leaving anyone behind." She tapped a button on her console. "Greg, the Krath are coming. Get those people out now. Move fast." Greg's voice came through the comms, laced with urgency. We're doing our best, Commander, but they're already hitting the landing zones. We need cover. Hold on, Greg, Helen shouted. We're coming to you. The Krath fighters close in on the evac zone, and just as the Darwin's Hope prepares for a desperate escape, a blast rocks the ship's hull. The crew is forced to make a choice, fight back or evacuate with the last of the survivors. The Darwin's Hope lurched violently as a blast struck the ship's hull, sending a jolt of fear through the entire crew. Alarms blared across the bridge, and the lights flickered as the shockwave rippled through the ship. Report, Helen's voice cut through the chaos, her heart pounding in her chest. Ben was already at his console, frantically analyzing the damage. Hull breach on Deck 3, Commander. We've lost one of the landing bays, and the auxiliary power is failing. Helen's hands clenched into fists. The ship was falling apart under their feet, but there was no time to stop. The Krath were closing in, faster than anyone could have anticipated. Can we repair it? Helen asked, even as she knew the answer. Not in time, Ben replied grimly. We've got fighters incoming. They're going to take out the Hope if we don't do something. Helen glanced at the comms panel. The evacuation had to continue. They couldn't afford to stay and fight the Krath head-on, but they couldn't abandon the survivors either. Greg, she said, her voice steely, how's the evacuation? We've got about half of them on the transports, but the Krath are pushing hard, Greg replied through the comms. We need to get the last of them out, but we're under fire. My team's holding the line, but it won't be for long. Get those civilians out, Helen ordered. We'll cover you. She turned to Maya, who was already assessing the situation on the bridge. How's our remaining firepower? We've got minimal shield strength, Maya reported. Our weapons are functional, but only for a short burst. We can't take much more before we're sitting ducks. Helen's mind raced, adrenaline surging. They couldn't afford to sit still. The Krath were relentless. She had to make a choice, take the Darwin's Hope and escape with the survivors, or stay and fight, risking everything to buy them a few more minutes. Get me Captain Morrison, Helen said, her voice calm but commanding. A moment later, the image of Captain Kate Morrison appeared on the comms screen, her face lined with exhaustion and determination. Commander Wright, I heard we're in the middle of a mess down there. You could say that, Helen replied, forcing a smile through the tension. The Krath are pushing us hard. How's the Washington? Under heavy fire, Kate answered. We've lost one of our frigates and another destroyer's heavily damaged, but we're holding the line for now, just barely. Helen nodded, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. If the Washington was still in the fight, maybe they had a chance. Kate, we've got civilians on the ground. We can't hold much longer, but we can buy you time. Get your fleet to us. We need cover for the last evacuation. Kate's eyes hardened. We're coming, Helen. Just make sure your people get to those ships. Meanwhile, on the surface of Veli's Prime, Greg's team was spread thin, keeping the Krath at bay as the last of the civilians made their way toward the landing craft. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the sound of gunfire and explosions was deafening. Greg moved with purpose, his rifle raised as he took cover behind the remains of a collapsed building. His team was scattered, using the ruins for cover, while civilians, guided by Corin and his people, streamed toward the transport zones. Move it, Greg shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The first wave of civilians had boarded the transports, but there were still hundreds left. Come on, get to the transports now. The ground trembled beneath him as Krath warships swooped overhead, firing down on the evacuation zones with deadly precision. A blast from one of their plasma cannons hit the building next to Greg, sending debris flying. He ducked, shielding his head as the explosion echoed through the streets. Greg, you've got to hurry, Maya's voice came through his earpiece, her voice strained. We're losing power. If you don't get those civilians to safety, we're not going to be able to pull out. Greg's pulse raced, but he pushed the panic down. I'm not leaving anyone behind. Get ready to evac when the transports arrive. We're coming for you. He turned to his team. Form up, we need to clear the next route. Let's move. Back in space, the Darwin's Hope was in free fall. The Krath had concentrated their fire on the ship, and now the Hope was dangerously close to being overwhelmed. With the hull breach on Deck 3, oxygen levels were fluctuating, and power was rapidly draining from critical systems. Maya, Ben, get the shields back online, Helen ordered, her voice tight with urgency. She was packing, her mind whirling with possibilities. We need enough power to make a quick exit. I'm on it, Ben replied. But at the rate they're hitting us, I don't know how long we'll last. Helen's eyes moved from the comms panel to the viewport, where the planet's surface was now a burning haze. The Krath fighters were in full pursuit. The remaining transports were still grounded, and with every passing second, the Krath were closing in. A burst of static crackled through the comms. Commander, we've got incoming fire from multiple directions. We can't hold them off much longer. It was Greg's voice, strained and frantic. Get those civilians on the transports, now, Helen shouted, her heart racing as she looked at the crew. We're doing the best we can, Commander. Greg's voice broke through, just as another blast hit the hull of the ship, sending it into a violent spin. Ben's hands flew over his console, his voice tight with panic. Shields are down to 10%. We won't survive another hit. Helen turned back to the comms, her mind made up. They didn't have the luxury of time. Maya, Ben, plot a course for the nearest escape route. Full speed, whatever it takes, she ordered, her voice cold with determination. Get us out of here now. Just as the Darwin's Hope made its final push to escape the Krath forces, a new signal cut through the chaos, slicing into the transmission channels with a suddenness that took Helen by surprise. Human ships, this is High Commander Zerx of the Galactic Council Defense Force. You are operating in violation of Council military protocols. Stand down immediately and withdraw from this system. The words hit Helen like a punch to the gut. She didn't hesitate, her eyes narrowing as she responded through clenched teeth. This is Commander Helen Wright of the Darwin's Hope. We will not stand down. We're saving lives. High Commander Zerx's voice crackled again, laced with authority. You are outmatched. The Veli's prime situation has been deemed unsalvageable. Withdrawal is the only option. Helen's heart raced. The Council, once her ally, was now working against her. She knew what this meant. The Hope was too far gone to escape alone. But there was no turning back now. The evacuation had to continue. She looked at Ben, who was preparing the ship for whatever would come next. Ben, take us out, whatever the cost. The Krath are closing in on all sides, and the Darwin's Hope is damaged beyond repair. The Galactic Council's intervention comes just as Helen prepares to make the hardest choice of her life, save the civilians or sacrifice the ship and crew for a chance at survival. The Darwin's Hope groaned under the pressure, its hull buckling as another blast from the Krath fleet slammed into the ship. The bridge lights flickered, casting the crew in harsh shadows as the ship shuddered violently. We're not going to make it, Ben shouted, his voice high with panic. He was desperately trying to keep the ship stable, his fingers flying over the controls, but the systems were failing faster than he could manage. Helen gritted her teeth, her heart pounding in her chest. The Krath were relentless, and the ship's hull was starting to show the telltale signs of collapse. A loud screeching sound echoed through the corridors, and the vibration from the engine failure shook the floor beneath her feet. They had moments left. Ben, she snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. Get us to the escape route, now. Ben didn't respond verbally, but his hands flew faster over the console. Working on it. We've got maybe 5 minutes before the Krath turn their full fire on us. The tactical display on the bridge was filled with blaring red warnings, showing the Krath fleet closing in. 50 capital ships and dozens of fighters surrounded the Darwin's Hope, cutting off all escape routes. Helen's mind raced as she considered their options. They had no way to outrun the Krath. The Darwin's Hope was no match for the massive warships in pursuit. The ship was losing power, and every second felt like an eternity. They needed to find a way out, or die trying. She turned to Greg, who had just entered the bridge, sweat dripping down his face as he wiped his brow. His expression was tense, but he still held himself with that calm, stoic demeanor she had come to rely on. The last of the civilians are on the transports, Commander, Greg said quickly. We're getting as many out as we can, but the Krath are closing in. If we don't move fast, they'll be trapped on the surface. Helen nodded. I know, Greg, we'll make it out. You'll get them to safety. He glanced at her, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Commander, with all due respect, we've got nothing left. The Krath will destroy us in minutes. We can't leave them behind, Helen said, her voice sharp. We'll hold off the Krath for as long as we can, get the last of the survivors out. Greg didn't argue. He simply nodded and moved to rejoin his team. Every second counted. Helen watched the view screen as the transports lifted off one by one, their engines roaring as they shot into the sky, heading for orbit. She saw a few Krath fighters swoop down, trying to intercept the last few ships. "We're not leaving them to die," Helen muttered to herself, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. "Not after everything we've done." On the surface of Veli's Prime, Corin's breath came in short, frantic bursts as he herded the remaining survivors toward the final transport. The streets were chaos, civilians running for their lives, Krath forces closing in, and the explosions that rattled the ground beneath their feet. The last transport ship was just about to take off when a group of Krath fighters swooped in, targeting the landing zone. The soldiers on the ground opened fire, but it was clear. The Krath were not here to negotiate. "Get to the transports now," Corin shouted, grabbing a young girl by the arm and pulling her toward the shuttle. "Move, move." He heard the distant roar of the Darwin's Hope as it opened fire on the Krath ships, trying to buy them time. His heart swelled with gratitude and desperation, but it wasn't enough. The Krath were coming. "Corin," a voice shouted from behind. It was one of his people, a woman struggling to move an injured man. "We can't carry him much further." Corin stopped and turned to them, his pulse racing. The woman's face was pale with exhaustion, and the injured man was barely conscious. "Take him," Corin said, glancing over his shoulder. "I'll cover you, just get him to safety, now." He turned back toward the incoming Krath fighters. The few remaining survivors were almost to the transports, but the Krath weren't going to let them escape. The sound of plasma fire erupted around him as the Krath ships began strafing the area. He ducked behind a column, his heart pounding, as debris rained down around him. The transports were still taking off, but it was getting harder and harder to keep the survivors safe. "Corin, we need to go now," a voice shouted. He looked up to see the last of the evacuees boarding the final transport. It was now or never. With a final glance at the destruction around him, Corin ran toward the ship, his legs burning from the effort. He could hear the explosions growing louder, feel the ground shaking beneath him. But he had to make it. The last transport lifted off just as the Krath fighters closed in. Corin barely made it on board, his heart racing with relief as the hatch slammed shut behind him. Back in space, Helen stood at the bridge, her hands clenched around the console as the Darwin's Hope took another hit. The Krath fighters were now swarming them, firing relentlessly. The ship was barely holding together, but Helen wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't. "Ben, any sign of reinforcements?" she asked, her voice tight. "Negative," Ben replied. "The Krath have us surrounded. We're not going to last much longer." Helen's eyes flicked to the tactical screen. The Krath fleet was closing in, their guns trained on the Darwin's Hope. The ship was taking on water, the outer hull scorched and crumbling. It wouldn't survive another hit. But just as she was about to give the order to abandon ship, the unexpected happened. "Commander," Maya shouted. "Incoming transmission, it's from the Washington." Helen's eyes widened. "Put it through." A hologram flickered to life on the console, revealing the face of Captain Kate Morrison, her expression grim but resolute. "We've received your distress signal, Commander," Kate said, her voice steady even through the static. "You've done everything you could, now it's our turn." Helen's heart leaped. "Kate, you're coming for us." "We've got the Krath in our sights. We're going to clear a path for you, hold on." The Washington and its fleet arrive just as the Darwin's Hope is about to be overwhelmed by the Krath. But can they clear the way in time to save the ship and the last of the survivors? The Darwin's Hope was gasping for breath, its hull cracked and battered under the onslaught of Krath fire. The ship's lights flickered, casting the bridge in a cold, dim glow. Each impact from the Krath fighters sent violent tremors through the ship, and every second felt like an eternity. Helen stood at the command console, her hands gripping the edge as if it could anchor her to the moment. The Hope had given everything it had, and now, all she could do was hold her ground and pray that Kate and the Washington would arrive in time. "Ben, status report," she barked, her voice sharp despite the tension. Ben's face was pale as he examined the displays. "Hull breaches on decks 2 and 5. Oxygen levels are fluctuating. We're running on emergency power and the shields are almost gone. We can't take another hit." Helen's jaw tightened. They had no way out except through. "Can we get the engines back online?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I've tried everything," Ben replied, his voice tight. We're dead in space unless we get external help. Helen's gaze shifted to the tactical display, where the Krath fleet surrounded them in a tight formation, like predators circling their prey. The Darwin's hope was cornered, and escape was no longer an option. She turned to the comms officer. "Any word from the Washington?" Just as the words left her mouth, a new voice crackled through the comms, cold and commanding. "This is High Commander Zerx of the Galactic Council Defense Force. You are in violation of Council protocols. Cease your resistance immediately." Helen's heart sank. Zerx, the same High Commander who had ordered them to withdraw earlier. "We're not surrendering, Zerx," Helen snapped, her tone hard. "We're not backing down from our duty." A moment of silence stretched out before Zerx's voice came again, this time more pointed. "You are outmatched and out of time. You have no chance against the Krath. Your actions have no place in the Council's plans. Stand down now or face the consequences." Helen's fists clenched. "The consequences are already here," she muttered, "and we're facing them head-on." Just as she was about to respond, a new voice cut in. This time it was Kate Morrison. "Helen, hold on. We're clearing the way. It's going to get rough, but we'll get you out of there." Helen's heart lifted for the first time in what felt like hours. "Kate." "We're coming for you, just stay alive," Kate's voice urged, filled with the determination Helen had come to expect from her. "We've got Krath fighters closing in, but we've got the firepower to give you the window you need. Get your crew ready. We're almost there." On the surface of Veli's Prime, the last of the survivors were aboard the final transports, barely escaping the Krath's deadly reach. Corin stood at the hatch, looking back at the ruins of his homeworld as the doors slammed shut behind him. The streets he'd walked through his entire life were now nothing but smoking craters. "Is everyone here?" he asked the transport crew, his voice hoarse. "Everyone accounted for Corin," the crew chief responded. His face was grim, covered in soot and ash, but his eyes were full of hope. "We're ready to launch." Corin glanced around at the survivors packed into the cramped hold, some silent with grief, others too exhausted to speak. They had survived the Krath's fury, some of them by sheer luck, others by the courage of those who refused to let them die. The transport engines roared to life, and the ship slowly began its ascent, leaving the shattered world of Veli's Prime behind. Outside, the Darwin's hope was still holding its ground, but just barely. The Krath fleet's focus was shifting toward the remaining ships, and the hope was becoming a sitting target. In orbit above Veli's Prime, the Washington's heavy cruiser guns fired in a deafening barrage. Kate stood at the helm, her hands steady as she watched the Krath fleet's formation on the tactical screen. "Clear the path, people," she shouted. "We're not here to win a battle, we're here to save lives." The Washington's fighters launched in waves, racing toward the Krath ships, their missiles streaking through the darkness like fiery comets. The Krath, taken by surprise at the sudden intervention, scrambled to reorganize their forces. But it was too late. The Washington was too big, too powerful, and too determined to be stopped. Kate's voice was calm but forceful as she issued orders. "Focus on the Krath capital ships. The Darwin's hope needs an opening, and we're going to give it to them." Missiles exploded against the hull of a Krath capital ship, and the enemy fleet recoiled, their attention divided. As the Krath fighters shifted their focus to the Washington and its fleet, the Darwin's hope, weak and broken, suddenly had a chance to escape. On the Darwin's Hope's bridge, Helen watched the space around them as the Washington and its fleet engaged the Krath. For a moment, the battlefield was chaos. Missiles flew, explosions rocked the ships, and the Krath warships reeled from the sudden attack. "Ben, do we have an opening?" Helen asked, her eyes wide with hope. Ben's fingers danced over the console, eyes locked onto the tactical display. "We've got about 15 seconds before the Krath come back at us full force. I can't guarantee we'll survive the exit, but it's our only shot." Helen's heart raced. 15 seconds, she couldn't afford to hesitate. "Plot a course to the escape route," she commanded. "Now." Ben quickly keyed in the coordinates. "Course plotted. We'll have to move fast, Commander." Helen turned to Greg, who was now back on the bridge. "Get your team ready. We're pulling out and we're doing it now." The Darwin's Hope surged forward, engines pushing it through the chaos as the last few Krath fighters launched their final assault. The ship's shields, weakened to their breaking point, held as the Hope tore through the firestorm. Helen's voice was a roar above the alarms as she called out, "Hold tight, everyone. We're almost through. Just as the Darwin's Hope was nearly in the clear, a final explosion rattled the ship, and the bridge was plunged into darkness. The Darwin's Hope has made it through the chaos, but the ship is critically damaged. As they race toward the escape route, they're not out of danger yet. Can they survive the final push to safety? The silence that followed the final explosion was deafening. For a moment, it felt like time had frozen. The Darwin's Hope drifted through space, its engines sputtering as the ship's battered hull creaked under the pressure. The lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the bridge. Helen's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the controls. The ship was nearly on autopilot, but she could feel the strain in every tremor of the ship's frame. They had made it through the worst of it, but they weren't out of danger yet. "Report," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. Ben was at his console, his face pale, eyes darting across the screen. "We've lost auxiliary power, Commander, but we're still on course for the escape route. The Krath fleet is pulling back, at least for now." Helen felt a surge of relief. They were still alive. The civilians they had evacuated, those who had managed to escape, would be safe. She turned to Maya, who had been quietly monitoring the ship's systems. "Maya, what's our status?" "Critical," Maya replied, her voice sharp. "We've lost multiple systems, Commander. Shields are down, engines are on reserve power, and we're at least an hour away from any kind of safe zone. We'll need full repairs when we get back to Earth." Helen's mind raced as she processed the information. They had a small window of opportunity, just enough to get them home, but no more. She glanced at the viewport, watching as the last remnants of the Krath fleet retreated into the distance. Their ships were vast and formidable, but they had underestimated humanity's determination. "What about the Washington?" Helen asked, her voice tight. Ben tapped his console again. "They're still holding their position, covering our rear. The Krath seem to be regrouping. They'll likely come back at us once they've reorganized." Helen nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's get to Earth. We're not out of the woods yet, but we'll make it." On the surface of Veli's Prime, the last of the transports had finally left the atmosphere, carrying the survivors to safety. Corin stood at the edge of the landing zone, looking back at the ruined planet. His heart was heavy, filled with the weight of what had been lost, but also the hope that humanity had given them. He turned to the other Velison survivors gathered around him. They had all seen the destruction, lived through it, and now they were survivors, thanks to the bravery of the Darwin's Hope's crew and the intervention of humanity. "They came," one of the elderly survivors said, his voice breaking. "They didn't have to, but they did." Corin nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, they came, and because of them we live." He thought of the humans who had risked everything to save them, of Commander Helen Wright, who had led the charge despite the odds, and of the crew who had fought to the bitter end. "They saved us," Corin repeated, his voice steady now. "We'll never forget that." In space, as the Darwin's Hope made its final push toward Earth, the crew found moments of calm. The ship's systems were damaged beyond repair, and the journey back would be slow, but they were alive. Helen stood by the viewport, staring at the distant blue orb of Earth, growing larger with every passing second. The sight of home was both a relief and a reminder of the sacrifices made. She had no idea what would await them when they arrived, whether Earth Command would welcome them back as heroes or question their actions. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that they had done the right thing. They had risked everything, not for political gain, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. "Commander," Greg said, stepping up beside her, "we made it." Helen didn't answer right away. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on Earth. She could feel the weight of the past few days pressing down on her, of all the lives they had saved and all the lives they had lost. "I wasn't sure we would," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we did." Greg placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture of solidarity. "We're going home, Commander. We made the right call. Earth's gonna know what happened here." Helen's lips curled into a small, bittersweet smile. "I hope so. They need to know what happened. The galaxy needs to know that we did this because it was the right thing to do, not because it was easy." Back on Earth, the Darwin's Hope's arrival was broadcast live across the planet. News outlets and media networks had already picked up the story of the evacuation, the battle, and humanity's decision to defy the Council. As the ship approached Earth's orbit, it was met with a chorus of cheers from the people who had been following the story. On the ground, governments and civilian organizations had already begun mobilizing to receive the Velosin refugees. The city streets were filled with people, volunteers, aid workers, and citizens, ready to offer their support. The moment the Darwin's Hope docked, there was no question of what would happen next. The crew was met by Earth Command officials, but the focus wasn't on reprimanding them for their actions. Instead, it was on the refugees who had made it to safety because of their courage. The following days were filled with briefings, debriefings, and endless media coverage. The crew of the Darwin's Hope were hailed as heroes. Helen found herself speaking before audiences, sharing the story of the Velosin people, of the Krath attack, and of the decision to act when no one else would. But as the media buzzed around them, as Earth Command put together official reports, Helen couldn't help but reflect on the lessons learned. Humanity had faced the impossible, stood against overwhelming odds, and chosen to save the lives of strangers, simply because it was the right thing to do. That was the true measure of who they were, who Earth was, and in doing so they had made their place in the galaxy. Months later, Corin stood before a classroom filled with children, both human and Velosin, teaching them about the history of Veli's Prime and of the brave humans who had saved them. "Do you know what they did for us?" Corin asked, his voice strong. "They gave us something more than just shelter. They gave us hope. Hope that when we call for help, there are still those who will answer, and we will never forget that." The children raised their hands, eager to learn more. But Corin knew that this lesson, this story, would continue for generations to come on both Veli's Prime and Earth. As he looked out at the students, he thought of Helen, of Greg, of the entire crew of the Darwin's Hope. They had proven something profound that day, not just to the galaxy, but to themselves. Humanity was not just a species of survival. They were a species of compassion, and in the end, that was what mattered most.